Ever wondered, why is it that certain thoughts feel unquestionable? Why does doubt feel forbidden even when it's sincere? And why do ideas about God, about right and wrong, about obedience and punishment continue to shape our behavior even when we believe we have outgrown religion? Those questions are not philosophical curiosities. They are indicators, signals. They point to something operating beneath our conscious awareness, something that quietly directs how we interpret reality, how we relate to authority, how we experience guilt, how we deal with fear, belonging, and worth. Most people never stop to examine that influence, yet it governs almost everything. And to understand it, we have to begin in a very grounded place. Not with belief, not with scripture, not with faith, but with definition. The word theology is defined as the study of the nature of God and religious belief. That single sentence carries enormous weight, because a study is not revelation. A study is a method, and every method is shaped by structure. Every structure is shaped by assumptions, and every assumption rests on a premise. No study exists in neutrality, which means theology is not God. It is how human beings in specific cultures, at specific moments in history, attempted to understand, to explain, and organize their experience of the divine. And here's the part most people never consider. If the premise guiding a study is limited, if it is fearful, if it is political or distorted, then the study itself, no matter how sincere, cannot arrive at truth. It can only refine the limitation that it began with. Now, this isn't about blame. It's simply how understanding works. And this explains far more than people are comfortable admitting. Theology does not only influence those who identify as religious. It shapes how societies define authority, how obedience feels virtuous, how punishment feels necessary, how guilt becomes internalized, how hierarchy feels natural, how fear disguises itself as morality. And even when belief changes, the framework often remains, because belief system doesn't simply vanish. They settle into the architecture of the mind. And this is why theology is not just something we believe, it is something that we inherit. And this becomes clearer the moment we step outside one tradition and look across civilizations. Every culture produced theology. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Africa, India, indigenous societies across the world, different names, different myths, different symbols, yet the same human themes repeat themselves with striking consistency. In society shaped by war and survival, God appears as a warrior, because violence must be justified. It must be sanctified and made righteous. A warrior God removes moral resistance to bloodshed. He allows conquest to feel holy. And this is how killing becomes obedience instead of tragedy. And once that archetype enters the psyche, power becomes associated with force, protection becomes associated with dominance, and aggression becomes mistaken for virtue. In empires, God becomes a king. Authority moves upward. Power becomes distant. Obedience becomes sacred. When God mirrors the emperor, hierarchy stops being cultural and starts feeling cosmic. Disobedience is no longer disagreement. It becomes rebellion against the divine order itself. And this is how people learn to submit even when systems are unjust, because authority has been baptized. In legalistic cultures, God becomes a judge, watching, recording, evaluating, rewarding, punishing. This archetype doesn't require soldiers. It installs surveillance inside the mind. People begin to police themselves. Guilt precedes action. Fear precedes thought. Shame becomes identity. At that point, control no longer needs chains, because the psyche becomes the prison. In patriarchal systems, God becomes male, not as metaphor, but as authority. Power flows in one direction. Leadership becomes gendered. Submission becomes spiritualized. Hierarchy becomes holy. This is not theology on paper. It is theology embodied in family structures, in institutions and relationships. Long after belief fades, imbalance still feels normal. And in tribal societies, God becomes exclusive, chosen, separate, superior. Identity requires an enemy. Belonging demands exclusion. Once this archetype is activated, conflict is inevitable, because God is no longer truth to be discovered, but a possession to be defended. From this, we can see that theology is not simply reflective of the church or religion, but is embedded in every aspect of our existence. Across civilizations, gods did not merely rule humans, they reflected them. Not because the divine was limited, but because perception was. This pattern did not disappear with Christianity, it intensified. Early Christianity was not a single system with a single understanding of Jesus. It was plural, experiential, and diverse. Some communities saw Jesus as a Jewish Messiah. Others saw him as an anointed human. Others as divine wisdom embodied. Others as the Logos expressed through flesh. Others as a cosmic Christ principle woven into reality itself. Different texts circulated. Different cosmologies existed. These groups did not merely disagree on details. They held fundamentally different understandings of reality, different notions of salvation, knowledge, and the nature of the divine itself were diverse. Some emphasized inner knowing over external authority. Some rejected literalism altogether. Some saw the material world as sacred, others as symbolic. And at this stage, none of these views were considered heretical. There was no single canon, no fixed creed, no centralized authority governing belief. Christianity had not yet hardened into a system. It was still fluid, still contested, still alive with inquiry. But that changed when theology encountered empire. Rome was not interested in mystical nuance. Rome was interested in order, in stability, and in maintaining control. An empire cannot survive competing truths. So interpretations were selected. Others were excluded. Councils were convened, not as spiritual retreats, but as mechanisms of governance. Once theology became doctrine, doctrine became law. And once belief became law, disagreement became crime. Heresy was no longer difference. It was now disobedience. And with disobedience carried consequences. Exile, suppression, loss of position, eventually death. Truth ceased to be something once discovered. It became something one complied with. Empire does not ask what is spiritually true. Empire only asks what will establish order and govern. And when Christianity moved outward through conquest and colonization, theology traveled with it, enforced, not offered. This was established through the Crusades, the Inquisitions, forced conversions, and colonial education systems. Belief was driven into population through fear. You had orders like the Knights Templar. These symbolize a fusion of religion, military power, and authority. The message was unmistakable. Believe correctly or suffer the consequences. We need to understand that fear imprints faster than love, and beliefs installed through fear do not remain ideas. They become survival programming. And this is why theology still governs modern life, even in secular societies. Courtrooms still resemble temples. Leaders still resemble kings. Laws still echo commandments. Punishment still feels moral. Control still feels like safety. The architecture never disappeared, only the language changed. This is the hidden foundation most people never see. Theology did not just shape belief, it shaped the human operating system. And until that operating system is brought into awareness, truth will always be filtered, distorted by archetypes that were never consciously chosen. This is why higher truths are resisted. This is why Christ consciousness was weaponized. This is why logos was reduced to doctrine. Because you cannot introduce liberation into a psyche still ruled by the warrior, the king, the judge, the patriarch, the tribal god. Truth will be rejected before it is even heard. So before we speak of Jesus, before we speak of Christ, before we speak of the logos, we must sit with a deeper question. If theology is a structured study and power shaped the structure, what exactly have we been studying all our lives? That question opens the door to what comes next. Doctrine, dogma, and the architecture of control. This is the Sacred Curriculum, the Hidden Foundation Series, Part 1. Subscribe and click on the notification bell for Part 2 and more. It is time to remember who you are.